Hi YouTube, Darth here. This is CTE Sunday, where I run down all the week's latest and greatest on the community test environment. This week is totally jammed full of updates again, as we're deep in the middle of a vehicle rebalance from DICE. No doubt you've heard about some of these already, but today I'm going to talk about all the changes to armor, boats, weapons, and the community jungle map. So let's get started. First up on the rebalancing are the tanks in Battlefield 4. On the protection side of things, the armor on the tank has gotten a few tweaks. The top-down multipliers for the tank have been decreased, meaning that the projectiles that hit the top of the tank that are affected by angles will now do slightly less maximum damage. The stated goal here was to make tanks more survivable on maps with high verticality. The other update to the armored protection was that the front now takes slightly more damage when the tank is facing straight on. What this will do is increase the value of turning your tank at an angle oblique to the enemy tank, thus slightly increasing the skill requirement for head-on engagements. And then nearly every weapon for tanks was also changed. First, the AP and sabot shells have had their impulse decreased so that choppers will have a slightly better chance of surviving a direct hit. Other than that, they remain unchanged. Next, the HE shell had a pretty big change, modifying it from its role as a heavy damage dealer against armor with low splash to being an anti-infantry shell. It does far less direct damage, but far more splash damage, so it only took a small damage hit on damage to armor. Because of the reload times, this makes the AP and sabot shells the clear winners for the anti-armor role. Additionally, it will be renamed the HEDP to reflect its new dual purpose. Now, the staff shell is one of those secondary choices that not a lot of tankers run after the reload was tied to the main cannon. To give it a more defined role than it currently has, DICE LA has reduced the amount carried to 2, it now reloads twice as slowly, they reduced the speed, removed the ability to lock on behind cover, but the bonus it now has is that it does 30 damage instead of 20. This means that it can now disable a tank to make it easier to hit with the main cannon. It works roughly like a slightly more powerful MBT Law. I had completely forgotten that the guided shell even existed, but DICE has also given a purpose to this weapon by greatly extending its range from 300 meters to 550. It also is no longer affected by angle to the target. Finally, the driver LMG and HMG were both slightly tweaked. The LMG had its overheat reduced by roughly 10%, so you can now fire it slightly longer. The HMG now overheats 45% quicker, recovers from overheating somewhat faster, and it does 5 damage less than previously. Not to completely hose the HMG now fires at 670 meters per second, up from 500. So it should be substantially easier to hit moving targets at long range. So the tank changes are primarily aimed at providing parity of choice among the very same-ish weapons and loadouts that exist now. Infantry fighting vehicles saw some tweaks this week, though not nearly as many as tanks. First, the hitbox of the IFV was slightly altered to add top hits to the chassis of the vehicle, increased from just the turret. Additionally, the top speed, acceleration, and ability to climb hills was also slightly increased. As for the weapons, the IFVs saw 2 tweaks. The anti-armor shell, the APFSDS-T shell, had its damage increased pretty substantially overall. And holy crap, is that a mouthful. Going from 24 to 32 damage, this represents a 33% increase overall, so the anti-armor shell gives a fairly serious upgrade to the overall damage per second of the IFV. This should give IFVs played smartly a much better chance against tanks. And lastly for the IFV, the LMG had its damage increased by 5 on the minimum and maximum. It also generates heat roughly 10% more slowly. This was done to make it a more competitive choice with Zunis or tows. In the water, both the Rib and attack boats saw some changes this week that are pretty significant. First, the lesser of the two, the Rib, saw an increase to its maximum health by 50%. This should make the vehicle, which holds up to 4 passengers, slightly less squishy against surprise attacks. Additionally, the miniguns on both the Rib and attack boats saw an increase in damage from 10 max 2 min to 12 max 6 min. This should add serious firepower and particularly anti-aircraft teeth to the minigun-wielding passengers on both boats. The first thing that the attack boat captains should be aware of is that DICE LA added damage angles to the attack boats. The gist of it is that the closer to a 90-degree angle, the more damage, up to a 1.3 multiplier. At a 0-degree angle, it's a 0.9 multiplier or 10% decreased damage. In theory, like tank battles, this should reward captains for smarter play rather than just trying to pump out as much DPS as possible against one another. As far as the weaponry goes, all 3 cannons saw changes. The 25mm had its splash radius increased, the damage was increased from 20 to 22, its restock speed increased by almost 50% to 12 seconds, and it flies straighter and faster than previously. The 30mm had its damage decreased to 22 to be standardized with the 25mm, but has a roughly 50% multiplier against ground vehicles, meaning it does more damage faster against them but runs out of ammo more quickly. The 30mm is going to be superior in a sustained vehicle-on-vehicle fight, as it will have finished reloading after a full dump before the 25mm. Finally, the burst cannon took a small hit to its effectiveness, which makes sense as the miniguns now do increased damage. The burst now does 2 less damage per shell, but restocks in 12 seconds as opposed to 20, so really a trade-off. Ultimately, the restock speeds have been normalized between the 3 choices, and it really comes down to dual purpose with the 25mm, anti-vehicle with the 30mm, and anti-air with the burst. This week, Dice LA introduced the concept of speed inheritance to vehicle projectiles. This means that whenever you fire a projectile, it inherits the velocity of the vehicle that fired it. Think of it like deviation based on speed and direction, but with a certain degree of predictability. What this ultimately means is that you'll need to compensate for your vehicle's speed based on the position of your target. The further away a target is and the faster your vehicle, the more you'll need to compensate. In theory, this adds another complexity to vehicle combat that increases the skill gap between players, those who can deliver on a targeted range and those who cannot. In practice, I have not seen a humongous difference in a majority of tank battles, but there have been some occasions where it's come into play. In a surprise switch, C4 got a nerf, reducing it from 500 damage to 400. What does this mean for most players? Tanks now take 3 satchels of C4 instead of 2. In my opinion, the effect of this change has 2 primary purposes. First, it gives gunners and tanks more opportunity to deal with an immediately dangerous threat. I'm kind of lukewarm on that, as I can think of times where it's felt perfectly fair that a tank was killed by C4, and there have been times where it seemed impossible to stop the explosion. But the other major reason I could see for this change is to drastically reduce the instance of near-miss major criticals or kills on tanks. Currently, as long as C4 lands within 5 meters of a tank, that tank is not moving again for 10 seconds as it is frozen by the major critical. This gives the C4 infantry plenty of time to follow up and blow the tank sky high. Additionally, 2 near-miss satchels are enough to completely destroy a tank. The C4 applying infantry doesn't even need to be close to their target as C4 is tossed. Now, this change doesn't preclude the possibility of the infamous Jeep delivery, and because both recon and support carry 3 satchels, both have enough for a fatal blow with any field upgrade. And consider that it generally took 3 satchels in Battlefield 3, and in that game C4 was plenty dangerous to tanks. Now, before I talk about the other explosives, I want to touch on one last C4 change. C4 has been increased in reload time to an 8-second reload time. Across the board, most explosives in the game have had their reload time standardized to 7 to 8 seconds. This includes grenades, engineer rockets, XM25 ammo, and many other varieties of explosive. The change makes sense in the context of explosive spam. Whenever Dice LA would change one explosive's reload time, players spamming explosives would just switch to the fastest reload, be it rockets, C4, or what have you. In the case of C4, the low reload time and large damage and splash radius meant that a single support could lock down a choke point indefinitely. Now, this also means that grenades are coming down from their 20+ reload time to only 7 or 8 seconds, depending on the grenade type. To be completely honest, that 20+ reload time essentially meant that they were never going to be reloaded, as the moment a soldier moved away from their supply bag, the timer reset. Overall, this will mean that we'll see more grenades but less explosive spam, as they are all now being treated equally. Everybody's 2 favorite explosive spammers, the mortar and UCAV, are making a small comeback. The mortar has had its initial spawn decreased to 15 seconds from 30, and its replenishment time is now 60 seconds to get a new mortar. The UCAV has had both its initial time and replenishment time decreased to 40 seconds from 60. However, it has also had its damage nerfed pretty significantly. It now does 20% damage against armor, down from 40 on a direct attack, and its airburst damage is now 125 damage, down from 200. Still plenty enough to kill infantry, but not very effective against vehicles. Why the change? Well, to be honest, these 2 gadgets virtually disappeared from the game in the spring patch. While they're not going to come rushing back all of a sudden, they will at least be slightly more common than they are now. Finally, work continues on the community map, as DICE did quite a bit of polish work this week on the released modes of the map: Conquest, TDM, CTF, Chainlink, Domination, and Rush. It's actually pretty exciting to see that DICE is supporting all the game modes on the community map, and I'll be particularly interested in seeing if Chainlink, which is currently exclusive to Dragon's Teeth, will be released to vanilla players when this map lands, possibly later this year. And as one final nice touch this week on the community map project, DICE added a new variant of the M60 to the Conquest version of this map. This is called the M60 Alt, and it can only be hip-fired, and it fires explosive bullets. It's a pretty humorous little addition and nod to the theme of the map, and it'll definitely draw some player attention when this map releases hopefully sometime later this year. As with every CTE Sunday, I have a laundry list of smaller fixes that I'll touch on briefly. First, the amphibious assault vehicle had its health increased by roughly 25%. Next, the MAA no longer can hit air vehicles below radar with seeking weapons, as the Heat Seeker is now penalized by below radar. DICE LA increased the amount of splash damage done by the M136 battle pickup. The mare's leg now drops off to 60 meters, up from 45. Aircraft glass is now, at least temporarily, bulletproof. The M323GL is slightly more effective, the minimap soldier icons read slightly better, and support was added for tweaking vehicle repair rates on a per-vehicle basis. That last bit leads me to believe that there may be a scout helicopter repair rate nerf in the near future. Before I wrap up this episode, I wanted to talk about something that has been vexing me terribly. In the community at large, I've seen a lot of knee-jerk reactions to these changes in the last week, particularly from players and community leaders who are failing to do one of three things. Either see the changes in the bigger picture, wait until the breadth of the changes are in, or they fail to play on the CTE for any length of time with the changes in context. I think this is particularly bad behavior coming from sensationalists who like to point to one weapon, describe how they feel it completely breaks the game, which would be true if nothing else were changing, and then proceed to essentially freak out. My advice to those of you who are having anxiety about these changes would be to first, absolutely play on the CTE, as talking heads describing these changes are one thing. Playing with them is another thing entirely. Next, really try hard to see what the bigger picture of the balance structure is. And I don't mean broad generalizations like, oh my god, DICE is catering to noobs. In the bigger picture of buff A plus buff B, what does the game look like? Divorce yourself from preconceived notions of what the retail game is like now, because it is changing. Finally, weigh in on the CTE subreddit with informed opinions and give meaningful feedback to DICE LA. Simple knee-jerk reactions are completely counterproductive. That's it for this episode of CTE Sunday. Obviously, I always like to hear what you folks are thinking about the CTE changes one way or the other. There's a lot of stuff here, and I'm sure everybody has something to talk about, so I'd like to hear in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.